A couple of things. First, I'm so happy to see that it's Attorney's Day somewhere. I think every day should be Attorney's Day. But I'm probably the only one who thinks that. Second, I was the beau. 37 years ago, for 25 years after that, I was the beau, and I was a lot meaner than I am now. I'm disgustingly cheerful most of the time now. Then I was not. But Bo litigates with a smile, so he's a lot friendlier to be around than I am when I was in the midst of a dispute. For the last 12 years, I've been with COSA, and my primary area when I was in private practice and now is dealing with special education issues. It's my favorite thing to talk about, so I'm happy to be here talking about it. We're going to hit on three things primarily today. The first one, we're going to look at making eligibility decisions under Section 504 for your students. Then we're going to talk just a little bit again about least restrictive environment, which I know Bo also spoke about. And then we're going to talk about some alternate diploma issues, which aren't issues just for the high school. There are important issues related to alternate diploma that start at the very earliest levels for students who may be participating in the OAP. So I'm glad everybody is here to get a little bit of information about that. If you'll go to the next slide quickly, and then the next one after that. In your abundant free time, that's sarcastic. If anybody wants more information about any of the things that are in this slide, or you want to see the sources of information that I used in this PowerPoint, look at these documents. The U.S. Department of Justice did some regulations back in 2016 that are relevant to what we're talking about. Next one. If you wanted to pick one 504 document to look at, you look at this one. It was issued in 2016. It's still a good document. It's very much an easy read, and it's not too long, and it covers every aspect of students and 504 right from the beginning, doing a comparison of the different laws, child fine, evaluation, eligibility, services, discipline. So it gives it all to you in a format that's super easy. I do want to remind you all that we have been waiting for new Section 504 regulations for quite a while now. They were supposed to be released in May and they weren't. Now we're told by the U.S. Department of Education that we're supposed to get them in August. So we're looking for them. August is not the best moment to get them, right? After you've done training for people and the school year has started. But we'll take them when we get them and we'll deal with it. But what we're talking about today, I do not expect to be affected much by any change in regulations. I feel like most of those changes are going to have to do with services and the delivery of a free appropriate public education to students who are on 504 plans. So that's just my guess, but we'll let you know through Diane when that information comes out so that you all can we can have discussion about what appropriate changes might need to be made in the way you're doing things. The last one, if you have a particular interest in ADHD, there is a document that was issued in 2016 also from the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and it's still a good document and it goes into a lot of detail about the particular issues in the context of ADHD. Next one. Okay, we're going to jump into eligibility. This is what I want you to keep in mind when we're talking about eligibility under Section 504. And I'm also going to throw in there, it's not really just under Section 504, it's also under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I'm not going to keep saying Title II. But every time I say 504, I want you to think in your head, oh, there's another law there. It's just that they're interpreted exactly the same way. So on your forms, you may see, on your Ed Plan 504 forms, you may see references to Title II, but everything that I'm telling you satisfies the requirements for both of those statutes, even if I don't keep saying Title II. Our students, if you'll go back, our students to meet the eligibility for Section 504 have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits the student's ability to perform a major life activity. And any of you who've been in 504, part of the 504 group of knowledgeable people, the ones who do everything under 504, you're familiar with that. What we're going to do is break that down and do a comparison of that with the IDEA to start out with. Next one. There are a number of slides here that we are going to skip because I want you to understand that there are other ways to meet eligibility under Section 504, but they're not what we're going to be talking about today. What we want to talk about are students that do have an impairment right now that substantially limits their ability to perform a major life activity. But Section 504 isn't just about students who have a disability, who have an impairment right now. It also protects students who people perceive to have a disability or perceive to have an impairment, maybe completely falsely, or students that have had an impairment but don't have one right now. Say a student who had cancer and is now cancer-free, maybe viewed as having a history of cancer, and that is viewed as a limitation on that student's ability to do certain things. So I want you to keep in mind, under the IDEA, you're always talking about, does this student need special education services? That's not what we are talking about under Section 504 at all. Sometimes, ultimately, we're going to have a student who receives a 504 plan that identifies the things that are going to be different for that student. But one of the things that the U.S. Department of Education views to be a primary issue with 504 is that not only might you have that plan and do things differently, but also that student has protections under Section 504 from discrimination based on disability, including protections from harassment, intimidation, bullying, etc. So I want you to keep that thought in mind, because a lot of times when we have issues under Section 504, it's because people are really intent on that, but I don't understand what services they need. And it seems to be a stumbling block sometimes to looking at a student's eligibility, because you're like, but they're doing fine in class. Where is the impact on learning? Where are the academic issues? Or where is the issue about their participation in this activity? But even if they didn't need anything different at all, I want you to keep in mind that if they meet the definition in physical or mental impairment, substantially limits major life activity, they are entitled to the protections of Section 504. So don't get all wigged out about the services they need. Focus on the definition and that eligibility statement. Impairment substantially limits major life activity. If you have a student that meets that criteria, then they're 504 eligible. If they're already on an IEP, we don't even have to walk down the 504 road, right? Because they're already getting all those protections. And if you're fulfilling your responsibilities under the IDEA, you don't have to do anything different under Section 504. So we don't go writing 504 plans for kids who have IEPs, because we can already do all that stuff through that process with the document that we've got. We don't need another one with another set of people and another set of deadlines and all of that stuff. We're already taken care of. So in your free time, feel free to review these slides about having a record of a disability or being perceived as having a disability, but that's not what we're focusing on today. If you'll keep going through those slides, another. See, we're already making progress, aren't we? Okay, here's where we're gonna start. 504 eligibility versus IDEA eligibility. And I want you all to think about those IEP, those eligibility meetings, those MEEGS meetings that you've been in for students under the IDEA, and then think about what the standard is that you're looking for there, as opposed to what you're looking at for 504 eligibility. Under the IDEA, the district does a comprehensive evaluation. They have to have evaluation components in all the areas that the law requires, and it requires different things for all the different categories of disability. If you think the student has an intellectual disability, it has a set of components. If you think the student has a specific learning disability, different ones. Other health impairment, different ones. For all of the 13 categories, different things. So when your team, when your IDEA eligibility team gets together, you review that comprehensive evaluation and you answer these 3 questions. For whatever category or categories that we're looking at, does the student have an impairment under that category as defined, looking at our documentation? If yes, then we go on to the next part. And does that disability, that impairment, does it adversely affect their educational performance? If yes, then we're on to the next one. And as a result of that, does the student need special education services? So we could have a student who, all 3 true, IDEA eligible. Let's write our IEP. Or you could have a student who may have the first one, the second one, but not the third one, or maybe not any of them. But that's what that process is all about. So I want you to contrast 504 eligibility again. What we're looking for is an impairment, yes, so that's very much similar to the first standard under IDEA eligibility, although the impairments are defined differently. But that substantially limits. That is a different standard than what we're talking about on adversely affect educational performance. Educational performance can absolutely be academic. It can be behavioral. We may have a student who, when they are sitting and attending and doing their work, they're great performers, but they don't do that a lot of the time. They are in and out of the classroom because they're super disruptive, let's say. That student could meet IDEA eligibility because their behavior or their emotional status adversely affects educational performance, as long as then they need special education services as a result of that. But substantially limits is a pretty low standard you're going to see under Section 504. Congress went in and redefined it 12, 13 years ago, and they said, you know what, you're setting the standard too high. That's not what we meant. And they kind of lowered it a little bit for 504 eligibility. But major life activities, what we're looking at there are everyday things. You're going to see that learning, that an impairment that substantially limits learning is just one of the many different possible major life activities that could result in a student being eligible. There is nothing at all under Section 504 about a student needing special education services. In fact, if you have a student who meets the IDEA eligibility but is on a 504 plan, that's a student that you ought to refer for evaluation under the IDEA, because the courts have held over and over again that 504 isn't a consolation prize, right? If you have a student who meets the 504 standard, 504 plan. But if then you discover that, okay, we're doing our best to meet student needs on that, but now we feel like the student needs special education services, that's the point at which you want to refer for IDEA eligibility and see if really they meet that standard instead. Next one. All right, let's look at the components of this eligibility we've been talking about. Next one. Okay, if you look at the Section 504 eligibility form on EdPlan, it's got long definitions of what physical impairment are and mental impairment are that don't really tell you much of anything because they're so legal and so broad. Let's go to the next one though. These, from the sources that I gave you at the beginning, are some of the actual impairments that are considered physical or mental impairments. So looking at all of these, you might say, gosh, there's a bunch of those that, wouldn't that student already be eligible under the IDEA? And if so, I mean, why is orthopedic impairment on there, or speech and hearing impairments? You know, on some of these, heart disease, wouldn't they already have an IEP? Well, they certainly might. And if they do, then we don't have to worry about that, all right? Because they're already protected by the IDEA and protected under Section 504. But there are some of these that are really pressing on school districts right now. For example, one that you're going to hear more about under 504, if you haven't already, is dyslexia. It's very clear that if a student has a diagnosis of dyslexia, and the parent brings in a diagnosis, which you aren't going to be giving, right? You may say through your screening process that our screening indicates that the student has characteristics that indicate a risk for dyslexia. That's not a diagnosis. Even if you did an evaluation for a specific learning disability for a child in the area of reading, you're not going to diagnose dyslexia, even if you found further information that, yes, you have characteristics of that. That's not what we do in schools. But parents may go outside the school district and get any one of the many different people who are now diagnosing, who are doing testing for dyslexia outside the public school, and bring you back something that says dyslexia. And that's going to require that you deal with that. So ultimately, we could see students who have dyslexia, which is considered a mental impairment. It could substantially limit reading or other major life activities. So yes, we could potentially see students who are eligible for a 504 plan and those protections because of the impairment of dyslexia, as long as it meets all of those. It's not just alone dyslexia, right? It's dyslexia that substantially limits their ability to perform one or more major life activities, reading just being one of those. Other ones that we see a lot of, and I'm raising this one only because it's been a big deal in Oklahoma in the past, in another school district long, long ago, diabetes. One of the things that the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education has said for a long time is, hey, school districts, be aware that, we know you have a state law that says you'll do certain things for students with diabetes, but just because you comply with the state law doesn't mean that you've done everything the federal law requires. So a particular district had an issue with this years ago, and if a parent came to them and said, hey, my child has diabetes, then they would go ahead and put that child on a 504 plan, go through the process, determine eligibility. But they had one situation where they didn't do that. The parent said, I want a 504 plan, and they just said, no, we're not going to do that here. And that parent filed an OCR complaint. OCR swept in, as they always do, and they looked at every child with diabetes in the district and said, okay, here's the deal. You think that because you are complying with state law that you're fine, but you're not fine. You have an obligation to find the students who have diabetes, because those students are almost certainly, to the last one, going to meet the 504 requirements, because diabetes is an impairment that substantially limits the operation of the body's endocrine system. So even if you can't point to like a doing kind of activity, it's the nature of diabetes to impact the operation of that major bodily system. And so if the student has diabetes, they're going to fall into that group. So district, you ought to be going out and finding those kids and talking to their parent about a 504 plan. So that's the position and that's the very first big thing that came to our attention here in Oklahoma that indicated how big those changes that Congress made to the law that I mentioned, 12, 13 years ago, how big and broad they were. Because before, that student may not have been eligible. You certainly wouldn't have gone out and said, I'm finding you because you have diabetes. But the world is different now because the law is different now. All right, let's go to the next one. And we could talk a lot longer about evaluation, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to raise a couple of points here. Because how many of you have had a situation where a parent brought in a diagnosis from a doctor, maybe for ADHD, maybe for anything else, and it says, student has X, needs 504 plan, or student has X, needs IEP. That was becoming so common, and it's taking up a lot of your time. But I want to focus on the medical assessment issue, because you have a lot of people who might say, my doctor diagnosed ADHD, and they might just tell you that. But you don't have anything, and you want to see something. Or the parent might say, my child has characteristics of ADHD, and you're like, okay, go get me something that says that, something from your doctor that says that. And I want to tell you what the Office for Civil Rights is saying about that. They're saying, look, you all are the ones who have the responsibility to do the evaluation, and it has to be free to the parent. Go to the next one, please. And if you all decide, as you would be if you said, go get a medical assessment, it may be one person telling the parent that, but it's that person presumably speaking for the district. If you say, go out and bring me back something where the doctor diagnosed ADHD or they diagnosed whatever it is, I've got to have that, then you are promising to pay for that. You may not realize you are, but if the parent comes back and says, hey, you should have done that, or you should pay for that, that's a tough corner for you, okay? So don't do that, all right? Instead, talk to Diane, talk to your psychologist in your building. Don't do that in that way, all right? That information may already exist, and if so, we want to go get it. But if we tell the parent to go out and get it, and it doesn't already exist, then we're going to own that, okay? So do you have to get a diagnosis? OCR says, nope, you don't. A student you don't diagnose ADHD, right? We do not. We might say, our student has characteristics that are consistent with ADHD, based on evaluation that we can do at school, but we don't make a medical diagnosis of that, and we don't need a medical diagnosis. If you're already administering medication to a child for a particular impairment, or you have an older diagnosis of an impairment that's expected to be a continuing one, you don't need something fresh and new from them. You've already got what you need. You don't need a parent spending their money to go out every year and tell you the student still has ADHD or whatever it is that they have. You've got the information that you need. So you don't have to have that diagnosis, much as you may believe that you do. As a matter of law, you do not have to have it. And you don't have to have it under the IDEA either. Let's go to the next one. What if all you have is a diagnosis? What if the parent came in and said, here's a piece of paper from my doctor that says my child has ADHD, and that's all you have? You don't put together any other information. And let me just say that usually the information that you're looking at as a 504 team, if the student already went through an IDEA evaluation and they didn't qualify, you've got all of that stuff from that comprehensive evaluation. But what if they didn't? The Office for Civil Rights has said in their guidance that usually the stuff that you need to decide 504 eligibility is just the stuff you've already got. I mean, the stuff that a school normally collects. I mean, attendance information, performance information, discipline, teacher anecdotal records, parent reports, things like that. unless the team says, gosh, we need to go out and get parent consent and do all this other stuff under section 504, that's usually not what you need to determine 504 eligibility. Impairment substantially limits major life activity. So if all you have is a medical diagnosis, that absolutely may trigger the team to start the process, but more than likely the information you're going to be gathering is stuff you've already got. Okay? All right, next one. Okay, major life activities. Next one. All right, we've got two different types of major life activities, as I already alluded to. I always, I never fail to destroy the mystery in advance. So I'm sure you all were waiting, but I blew it in the first part. We have doing type activities, and we also have major bodily functions. And those lists of what those things are under the law are all on the 504 eligibility form that's on Ed Plan. And again, it's the kind of stuff that you would expect. And OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, always says, look, we say it could be one of these activities or it could be one of these functions because you never know when you'll think of another one. So don't look at those lists and think, well, that's everything that could possibly be in the world. Because it's possible that there could be some other impairment that, substantially limits some other type of major life activity that's not contemplated by what's on the form. So just keep that in mind. Next one. Getting back to that same point, students can be 504 eligible even if the major life activity that is limited is not learning, all right? And I know that intellectually you all are probably going, well, yeah, everybody knows that. But sometimes in the calls that I get, people are all about, but I don't understand why this student would be eligible. They're doing everything they're supposed to do. Yeah, they have asthma, but they're doing everything they're supposed to do. Diabetes, doing everything they're supposed to do. Performance, great. Activities, great. Work hard. Everybody loves them. They're getting it all done. Why would we do this? It's because of impairment substantially limits major life activity. It's not about, do they need some special service? Yes, they might, and most kids do. But remember, it's also about the protection of the law for a person that has an impairment that rises to that level because they're an individual with a disability and they are protected from harassment, bullying, intimidation, etc., based on that disability, whether they need anything different that you put in a 504 plan or not. I think that's the thing that people often forget because they're so focused on the things that you're going to be doing differently that you need to put in your 504 plan, because that's what we do with an IEP, right? We have a piece of paper at the end. For kids who are on 504, who are 504 eligible, we often do have that plan at the end, but we don't have to. If the team decided we have looked at everything and there is nothing that we need to include on this plan that would say that we're doing this differently, because everything is covered. There's nothing that they need. Then you note that in Ed Plan on the form, but they'd still be protected from discrimination based on disability. And that, according to the Office for Civil Rights, is a great big deal that we sometimes just don't think about because it doesn't come with a piece of paper and a service. Next one. All right. Does the student's impairment, whatever it is, substantially limit one of those major life activities? Next one. What does substantially limit mean? Another one where I already gave it away earlier is that Congress has said that the standard that we were using before that change in the law was higher than the standard as they saw it. And they've kind of said something that is really, when I first saw it, it was hard for me to get over it because I thought, well, this is just ridiculous. If you're saying it substantially limits something, shouldn't substantially be like a big weighty thing, right? I mean, substantially seems like it's a great big deal. And they were like, no, it's not quite as high a standard as you think. And these are their words. They said substantially limit doesn't mean that the impairment either prevents or severely or significantly restricts a major life activity of the student. The term substantially limit isn't meant to be a demanding standard, and it should be construed broadly in favor of expansive coverage. So what they're saying is, if you're in your team meeting and you all are debating, I mean, there's a really hot debate about whether or not the student's impairment substantially limits a major life activity, they're like, stop fighting about that. Because in their view, eligibility, they get the protections. Just err on the side of providing those protections under the law. If you're going to fight about something, then fight about whether or not they need something different that you would put in a 504 plan, not over whether or not they get the protections of the law by having the status of a student who has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So that's their argument about why they are viewing the word substantially the way they are. Next one. Remember that your impairment only needs to substantially limit one major life activity, but it could substantially limit a number of major life activities for that student. So don't stop looking when you've identified the first one, because you're not going to write an appropriate 504 plan for that student, assuming that they need one, unless you've identified all of the major life activities that are substantially limiting. Just like under an IEP, you don't say, okay, we just need to identify primary disability, and we've already figured significant learning disability, that's here. Now, yeah, we think that they also meet the standard for other health impairment, but let's just not put that down as a secondary. What's the point? Because we've already got this one, so they're going to get an IEP. Same thing. Unless you are identifying the things that are the issues, then your document is not going to be addressing the needs of that student as they present through your evaluation. And also, if you have the type of disability or the type of impairment they use the word episodic. Say IBS, that there are times when the impairment waxes or wanes in its impact on the student. We don't say during the time when they are less impacted by it, well, you're not protected by 504 anymore, let's just close that out. And when you have a problem again, we'll come back and look at your eligibility again. We don't do that. Instead, we say you're always protected. There might be a difference in the services that you need during the time when you're not impacted by that impairment, but overall, you are constantly protected by the fact that you are a child with an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, even if it isn't substantially limited at that precise moment. They still have the condition, and we don't keep going back and forth based upon how it's affecting the student. Next one. Okay, mitigating measures. This is another thing that Congress did several years ago. They said, here's another thing everybody was doing wrong in the way they looked at 504 eligibility before. That what you were doing, and this started in the area of employment, and it went in, and this is what we did in schools too, back in the 90s and in the early 2000s. If we had a student, for example, who didn't qualify as being deaf or hearing impaired under the IDEA, but did have a hearing impairment, and when they wore their hearing aids, they were hearing as well as a typical student can hear, then they'd say, you don't meet the 504 eligibility criteria. Because when you're using that device, you don't need anything. And so what Congress went in and did and said was, that's completely wrong. You don't say, all right, you figured out something that helps that impairment impact you less. It takes away some of the things that makes it difficult for you. So we're penalizing you for that. You don't get protections from intimidation, harassment, bullying, etc., because you figured out something that makes your life better. So they went in the law and said, okay, here are the mitigating measures, next one, that they specifically, next slide, that they specifically put in there. And it's a ton of stuff, right? I mean, they're saying, you have a prosthetic limb, okay, and you still have an impairment, right? And it substantially limits a major life activity when you're not wearing it. And so you're an individual with impairment substantially limits major life activity. Now, later on, when we're trying to figure out what we're going to do different for you day to day, we're not going to write a plan full of stuff that has to do with a student who doesn't have a prosthetic limb, because we don't write a bunch of stuff that addresses the needs of a student that don't exist. If they reliably wear their hearing aid, take their medication, wear their prosthetic limb, if they have had, say, a student with autism, they have had extensive therapy, and now the impact of that autism on that student is much less great than it was prior to that time, then let's assume our student doesn't have an IEP, then we have to think, what would that student's look like? Look like meaning in terms of our major life activities, if they didn't have the benefit of that. So instead of saying, hey, that's great, you've done all these things, you don't qualify. Instead we say, okay, if you hadn't had that, if you didn't have that, if you didn't take that, then what would you look like in terms of the substantial limitation on your major life activities? So all those things we're calling mitigating measures, we just push those aside for purposes of eligibility. But when you're writing a plan, assuming that the student is eligible, you take them all back in, because we're writing a plan that looks like the student that we actually have with all of those things. So they're the student who has the benefit of these things. If they're wearing their hearing aid every day, maybe all we need to do is write on our 504 plan that we'll do a hearing aid check every day. If our student is taking medication and with that, their characteristics of ADHD are substantially minimized, so that the behavior disruption, the loss of concentration, etc., that the student had without medication, we don't have those issues. Maybe what we do is identify in our plan how we're going to make sure the student takes their medication, or if we see something that's inconsistent with our student who takes medication, maybe that's when we're making a call home to ask the parent about medication that day. We're not going to lard up our 504 plan with a bunch of stuff that particular student doesn't need based upon what they found to help them. Okay, next one. You do always consider regular eyeglasses and contact lenses when you're looking at mitigation measures. Otherwise, we'd all have a 504 plan. All right, next one. This may be helpful to you, and again, I've got it from all of those different resources that I've identified, telling you, and this is helpful to me because, I haven't had any experience with diabetes. So the thing about the substantial limitation on the operation of the endocrine system, I was like, what is that? I don't even know what that is. This instead identifies a lot of different impairments that you might see, and it identifies what typically that means in terms of its impact on the person's ability to perform doing type activities, or the impact on the operation of a major bodily system. So if you'll just, on the slides, just kind of go through these, you'll see it's telling you what they're substantially limiting. So what they're suggesting is that if you're in one of these, you're very likely to qualify if you in fact have that impairment, okay? Okay, what about ADHD? Let me just say that when I give a presentation, it's not designed to make anybody happy, and so that's good because it hardly ever does, and I hardly ever do. So ADHD, in that big document about ADHD that I told you had been written back in 2016, the Office for Civil Rights wrote in there that, look, we expect you to at least look at students who have ADHD to decide whether or not you need to take some action. We're not saying that all those students need to be on a 504 plan. We're just saying that if you're aware that a student has ADHD, you want to have somebody in the district who's looking at that situation and deciding whether you need to do something else. And they said, look, if we come in on a complaint and we see that you've never even talked about it, then we're going to assume they have a disability. So what they're trying to do is say, come on, guys. If you've got a kid who has that issue, at least look at it and talk about it. We're not saying you have to go down that road and say, let's look at eligibility for that student, but have a conversation about how it's impacting the student. All right, next one. Again, focus on outcomes here. I'm not going to go through all these slides because I want to do something else, but remember, focus on whether the student meets impairment substantially limits major life activity. Don't focus on the outcomes the student is delivering, all right? Because when you do that, you're probably looking past students that you ought to be talking about. Again, not saying that they're necessarily going to need to go down the 504 road, but if you're kind of blind to those three prongs of 504 eligibility, and instead you're going, wow, our kid performs great at home. He always gets his homework done, doing great on state testing. They've got a high GPA. What you may be overlooking is that at home, they may take 2 or 3 times as long to get their work done because of some impairment that they've got. They may be a student who is benefiting immensely from parental support in getting things done. So just an FYI on that, to keep that in mind, because I think thinking ahead to what would I put on a plan is the thing that sometimes gets in the way of determining eligibility. And some students we don't think about at all. Other students we may look at and go, but you can't be eligible because you don't need anything. And that's really not what this is solely about, okay? So let's finish this one. We'll just end this PowerPoint and move on to our next one. Because we've got 15 minutes and I don't want to spend any at lunch. You were laughing a lot at Bo. I'm not nearly as funny. I guess you're not. Did you all hear that? You'll get all of these slides so you can look at them again this evening. That was a joke. Okay, quickly on least restrictive environment. Let's go to the next slide. This is the legal standard, but we're not going to spend any time looking at a bunch of words because they don't tell you anything. Okay, next one. Sorry, if you read a law, then you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? And you need some more practical something or other. So, if you go back to the bottom of this, I want you to note that supplementary aids and services is in red. So what we're looking at here is including a student in the regular education environment with supplementary aids and services to the extent that we can do so satisfactorily. It doesn't say perfectly, right? It says satisfactorily. So that's not as high a standard. Let's go to the next one. When we're talking about in an IEP team meeting, what supplementary aids and services are, this is what it's typically broken down to. looking at accommodations that we could put in place that would enable the student to perform satisfactorily in an environment. Those are things that aren't going to reduce those educational expectations, or modifications, which do. Don't rely too heavily on modifications. Nevertheless, your ability to choose modifications is still very much a part of the law. But remember that to the extent that we're relying heavily on modifications, especially in an academic setting, then our student may be less prepared for, they may be getting less access to the curriculum that you want to. They're performing less well in class, and they're performing less well on your state mandated test. And also supports for personnel. And one of the only one I called out here, but there are many others, is what if we have a student who needs a behavior plan, and we've written a behavior plan? What could a potential support for personnel be? Training people to implement that behavior intervention plan, so that we don't say, okay, everybody go forth and implement this plan, and you look at it and go, what am I supposed to be doing with this? I mean, it says don't get in the student's space, so, what does that mean? I mean, am I supposed to stand back 10 feet? Am I supposed to just not stick my finger in his space? What is it that's supposed to look like? I mean, those are, because you're implementing that everywhere, probably, there are a lot of people who need that kind of training. People who may be outside their classrooms, making sure that students pass in the halls appropriately, people in the lunch line, people out at recess. I mean, they all need to know, don't get in his space. We're guaranteed a meltdown if you get up there and get, young man, we don't behave that way in 5th grade. Then, not that anybody would do that. I'm harking back to my early 70s years in finishing elementary school. So that's just one example, but there are many types of supports that people need that could come through other people providing information, resources, collaboration, etc. Okay, next one. On the continuum of placements, this goes from the least restrictive, the regular classroom all day long, all the way down to what's considered the most restrictive. And when you're in an IEP team meeting, you are supposed to start with the regular classroom all day long in mind. And your consideration should be, is there some combination of those supplementary aids and services that we could put in place that would enable our student to achieve satisfactorily in that setting? And there is no requirement. I mean, if the team says, really, there isn't. I mean, you give it some thought, really, there isn't a combination of things. You don't have to try it and watch it fail to succeed, all right? But you have to give it some discussion, all right? You have to consider, is there something that we could put in place? And remember, if the parent's suggestion is, well, if we just put an aid with the student, that would take care of everything, that's not the type of thing that you just go, okay, or you just go, nope. Instead, you ought to be doing some actual assessment that will give you something where you can say, we have considered what the need would be, whether it's in this setting because the student doesn't know how to do this, or they don't practice it. Maybe it's just over here in this one little scenario. So with those questions, it's very common for parents to be asking for that. Just keep in mind that if you need help navigating that, then Diane and her folks are just a phone call away. All right, next one. I just want to tell you that if you're having a dispute with a parent about whether a student is in the least restrictive environment, I suggest that you use this little test. And I would suggest that somebody other than somebody who's invested in the decision look at this. Because this is exactly what a hearing officer would do if faced with a least restrictive environment dispute. where the parents' issue was they ought to be in the general education setting more. And this comes straight from a case out of the 10th Circuit, so it's binding here in Oklahoma. So what the court is going to say is, look, can education in that regular class with the use of supplementary aids and services be achieved satisfactorily for the student? And if the school district says it can't be, no, we've made the correct decision, but the parent is saying you didn't. You're being overly restrictive because my student should be in the regular education classroom for all core subjects. No pullout. Then here's the test on the next slide. First, we're going to look at what you already did. I mean, were you looking at this with an open mind? Did you try some things? Let's say that the student has never, this is their first time in school. They're coming to you as a kindergartner. And if we say, oh gosh, this student can never make it in a regular education setting, we need to have this student in a lot more pullout, then the parent may have a better argument than you if it would have been possible to try something out with supplementary aids and services instead of jumping to the conclusion. I'm not trying to be judgy with that word, just coming to the conclusion without trying anything that this kid is a kid who's just got to be pulled out. There's no way this could possibly work. The next one, what are the academic benefits they're going to get in their regular education environment versus this environment that the district has chosen? And next, on the next slide, what about non-academic benefits? We don't necessarily think about that one so much because we're really focused on those academic benefits. But for students, there could be other social, communication, etc. benefits to being in a regular education setting. So it's on the list of things we're supposed to consider. And finally, and one of the ones that's a big deal to you all, is what's the effect on the class of the student being in there, especially a student who has significant behavior issues? You might say they're going to be super disruptive in this setting. They're going to have a meltdown when they come in here, and we can't have the education of other kids that's disrupted. And all I want to suggest to you about that is that the courts expect you to engage in some self-help here. So if what you're saying is this isn't going to work because we've seen the way the student behaves, no, there's nothing we can do to make that better. His behavior just needs to get better, and then we'll try it. But if we haven't done anything to work on the behavior, we don't have a functional behavior assessment, we don't have a behavior intervention plan that we're working on, then a court's going to come in and not give you a lot of credit because they're going to go, well, and you tried, what, nothing? So, at a minimum, in situations like this, our hearing officers in Oklahoma are very much focused on what did you do at school to address the behavior and to minimize its impact. So they are very much looking at what self-help did you engage in before you came to this conclusion. And if the answer is, we did a behavior contract, but it didn't work out. They may say, we didn't implement it with fidelity, people didn't use it, you did it for a week and it didn't work, so you decided it couldn't possibly work, and they're going to be really judgy about that. Okay. And bottom line, shortened school day, very much no as far as the State Department of Education is concerned, especially when the reason for the shortened day or home-based is behavior. They've put a ton of things on Ed Plan that a lot of hoops you have to jump through, a lot of things you have to have done before you're permitted to choose a shortened school day or home-based for behavior reasons. For example, they're telling you, don't even think about this until you've done a behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan, as well as you have a plan for how the student's going to return. This is what you're going to be doing while they're out to work on the behavior. They very much made it harder for you to legitimately go through that process and go home-based without doing a ton of stuff. You can go through the rest of this, and I'm very hesitant to do this, but I do want to say on alternate assessment, and I put this in my little 6-slide PowerPoint. What I want you to keep in mind is for the new alternate diploma, the only students who this is relevant to are students who are participating in an alternate curriculum and participating in the alternate assessment. But I want you to keep in mind that it's the obligation of the IEP team, starting at the earliest time, to make decisions about whether students are going to be participating in the alternate curriculum and the alternate assessment, and you make those decisions annually. And there is a very rigid, not as rigid, I think, as the State Department of Education is trying to make it, but they're trying to limit the number of students who are going to be participating in the alternate assessment to under 1% of all Oklahoma students. And we're way over. I mean, we're not horribly over, but we're way over as a state. The state can't make you, they can't tell you, hey, we're rejecting this because you're at 1.5% or 2% or whatever it is. But they are making districts that are really high, over that 1%, jump through some pretty significant hoops to try to bring those numbers down, because it's a penalty against the state if we exceed 1%. So what I want you to keep in mind when it relates to the alternate diploma is that when you are making that decision as a team, pay attention to what's on that criteria checklist. It's a little rubric where you're trying to figure out what level of support is a student going to need so that you are being as limited as possible. I know. So that you aren't making a decision that at some point you're going to go, gosh, maybe we should have had the student participating in the regular, in the regular curriculum. Maybe they could have taken the state assessment. Maybe they didn't belong here, but we've made a commitment already, and once we try to change that later, we haven't helped our student. They're not going to perform well from that point on because they haven't had the exposure to all of those things that other students have. And remember, for students who are participating in the OAP, if that's the student you have, if they did that as a junior, which is the last time that they're going to be assessed using that in high school, the only diploma they can earn is an alternate assessment. They are not going to be able to earn a regular high school diploma anymore. You can't prevent them from trying to earn a regular high school diploma, but the information that we've gotten from 2 adverse decisions, one from our administrative due process hearing in Oklahoma, and one from a State Department complaint where school districts lost on these issues, is that if you've got a student who's participating in the OAP and they legitimately should have been participating in the OAP, there is no way that they are going to be able to have satisfied the criteria for a regular high school diploma. So that's is a big difference that we're making. And the decisions that you're going to be making start at the earliest time. They don't start in high school. So pay close attention to that, please, because you're making a decision about course that it will be almost impossible to rectify. And I could say more, but I would be the only one left in the auditorium listening to myself talk. So thank you all very much for your attention.